That's in Part 4, and not one of those government members will defend it.
Mr Chairman,
The Honourable Phil Goff.
Mr Chairman, it is a worry that when you have a bill like this and an important part of the bill that's been introduced under urgency, that's had the period of time that submitters could make submissions on it curtailed, and then it finally comes to the House where we debate the individual provisions of this bill, that the Minister, who is not the Minister in charge of the bill, probably doesn't know what's in it, and that would explain why he's not taking the call, but not even the members of the Select Committee that do sit in this House have taken a call. The idea of the committee stages of the House is to enable the provisions in this bill to be thoroughly debated. I've heard Claire Curran, I've heard Grant Robertson stand up, raise legitimate questions about Part 4 of this bill, and there is no response. There is no response from the Minister, who's not interested, not even listening, no response from members on the Select Committee. This is, Mr Chairman, a really important part. For a start, it provides for network providers to be compulsorily registered. Now, we know with this bill and the bill that it actually puts into effect, which is the GCSB bill, that there are intrusive powers. There are intrusive powers against ordinary New Zealanders because an agency, in secrecy and without accountability, can intrude into their private communications. But Part 4 highlights the other important intrusive powers that this bill provides, and that is unprecedented powers in terms of the power of the state to direct private commercial companies to do things that the state wants but the private companies have to pay for. So the first requirement in Part 4 is that companies have to be registered. I'm sorry? I can't hear the member. He'll have to speak louder and more clearly. In fact, he should take the call. He should take the call because actually, Mr Chairman, the House has a guts full of members of Parliament that interject from their seat but don't have the conviction to actually take the call and debate the legislation. So what does this part do? First of all, it requires that all providers, network providers, be compulsorily registered. Secondly, it requires that every one of those companies must nominate an employee who will act on behalf of the state, who must get the security clearance to act on behalf of the state. Who pays for that? The state? No, I'm sorry, the private company pays for it. So you force them to register, you force them to nominate an employee that gets security clearance to do the government's work, and then it involves a power of the director of the GCSB to require any information or any document that he considers necessary. So the head of the GCSB can demand of a network provider that they provide any information, any document that he, the head of the GCSB, decides is necessary. Do they have any appeal against that? No, they don't. They must comply or they're taken to court and they can be fined, Mr Chairman, up to $500,000. $500,000 for not complying with these provisions. The enforcement provisions are stringent, the requirements are unusual, and you might say these powers, in the interests of national security, could be justified. You might argue that. But the onus is on the government, first of all, to demonstrate to this House and our country that it is important to have those powers that are exercised by the state, and secondly, that there are safeguards against the abuse of these powers. Now, I understand, and Labor understands, that you need security intelligence services. We understand that there are such things as organised criminal activities and terrorist groups that the state may need to be safeguarded against. But where you start, Mr Chairman, is to demonstrate that these powers are justified. And I would have thought that the government would have been prepared to let the critical agencies appear before our Select Committee, the police, the GCSB and the SIS. They do the work. They could, if they wanted, in secret. or in private session have come to the Select Committee and say, we need these powers because these are the activities that we are safeguarding against. They could have been, Mr Chairman, they could have been invited to appear before the Intelligence and Security Committee to make the same arguments in relation to the GCSB bill that this bill allows to be carried out. But no, the government suppressed from the democratic institutions of this House, the Select Committees, the right or the ability of the GCSB, the SIS or the police to come before the Select Committee. I haven't heard one minister or one member of the National Party stand up and justify why those agencies shouldn't have come before the Select Committee and said, this is the reason that New Zealand must have these powers. That's the starting point. Is there a need for these extraordinary powers? Justify them. That's the role of the government when it gives extraordinary powers to its agencies, is to say, this is why. And the government failed, and it failed absolutely. Secondly, Mr Speaker, there was the requirement. Now, there she goes. She's interjecting from a seat as well, so I hope she takes the call. I hope she's going to, and then we'll get a chance to respond. The other precondition, Mr Speaker, was that when you give these huge powers to the state, you ensure that there are safeguards to prevent the abuse of power by those agencies. That is, after all, why the GCSB bill came before this Parliament, because it was found to have abused its powers in the case of Kim.com, and when the Kitteridge report came out, it was found also to have exceeded and abused its powers against 88 other New Zealanders. So what we know from this is that there must be safeguards against the abuse of power. The next thing, and I want to come back to the safeguards in a minute, but the next thing I want to say is this. If we really need these powers because there are organised criminal groups and terrorists out there, and we need to intercept their communications, does this system put into place by this bill act effectively against criminal organisations and terrorists? And I asked the officials that at the Select Committee. I said, aren't there huge loopholes in this legislation? For example, an increasing percentage of the population these days are using over-the-top providers like Skype. Is Skype covered in this legislation? Does it have to have interception capabilities? And the answer is no. But no, the answer isn't even no. It's, I'm sorry, we're uncertain, we're confused, we're indecisive. We may give them those powers, but we won't do it in the legislation. We'll do it by regulation. We'll do it in a way that doesn't have to come back to this House. We'll do it quietly or secretly, almost. It won't come back to this House. So first of all, you don't put Skype and the over-the-top providers in. Then you don't put in the small network providers if they have less than 4,000 people. And then you don't, or this government finally realised that even if you have got the network providers in, because the communications are encrypted and the network providers don't have the means to decrypt the telecommunications messages, they can't do it. So I asked the officials that question, Mr Chairman. Does this bill do what you need to do? And the answer is no, there are loopholes you could drive an articulated lorry through. If you're a professional criminal organisation, you'll know where they can't intercept your communications and you'll use those means. So why are we putting all of this effort in when the professional criminal organisations can evade the telecommunications interceptions? And there is no answer to that. There is no answer to that. You might get the dummies that use communication that can be intercepted, but the professional crooks or Al-Qaeda, they know that. They know where you can get away with not being intercepted, and they'll use those routes. What I'm worried about this legislation, Mr Chairman, is that it won't get the real crooks, but it will allow these organisations to do what the NSA has done in the United States and the GCHQ has done in the United Kingdom, and that is to follow the communications of tens of thousands of ordinary citizens who have no connection with terrorist groups or criminal groups. So we get the worst of both worlds. We don't actually stop the bad guys, but we allow the scope for ordinary citizens to have their communications intercepted or recorded in metadata without having adequate protections. And I want to talk about why the protections aren't adequate. Well, for a start, Mr Speaker, the enormous power that exists in this area is... Mr Chairman?
Jackie Dean.
Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr Chair. The problem that Labor